Hello, my name is Jason Williams and I am glad to be here to talk to you about a couple of exciting theories when it comes to instructional design. The first is the cognitive load theory and the next is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. These two theories are the foundation for sound instructional design and will help you to ensure that your students will not only have an enjoyable time learning, but that they will actually learn the topics you're there to teach them. In order to understand the cognitive load theory, you must first understand the way in which your memory works. This is known as the architecture of cognitive load theory. It is founded in the different types of memory that are affected by learning new information. Specifically, when you're exposed to new information, it comes in through either the visual channel or the auditory channel, which is your sensory memory. Once the information enters your sensory memory, it is then transferred to your working memory. It is here that the real work happens. This is where you really begin to make sense of the information that has been presented to you. This is where you begin to make meaning by first either selecting the information and finding the relevant pieces, and then the information is organized into meaningful models. These models are key to the next part of the learning process. From here, the final step of the architecture begins. Your long-term memory begins to process and integrate the models into your long-term memory by making either connections to prior knowledge or by building new connections to solidify the knowledge into your long-term memory. All of this processing is where we, as instructional designers, can either make or break the experience for our students. One of the most important jobs that we have is to consider all of this processing that our students will be doing, and then we need to try and make it as easy as possible for them. To do this, we need to consider the three types of cognitive load that are going to be impacting our students. More importantly, we need to ensure that we are able to minimize these types of cognitive load. The first and most common type is intrinsic cognitive load. This is the load that is inherent to every learning. It is the load that is applied to the learner simply because he or she is learning something new. This type of cognitive load can be reduced by ensuring that you are not presenting the learner with too much new information at one time. The next type of cognitive load is extraneous cognitive load. This is the load that is produced by all of the other information that is presented to the learners. More specifically, it is the load caused by the way in which we present the information to the learners. Something as simple as adding a relevant text to a presentation or adding background music can increase extraneous cognitive load significantly. This is why it is so important that the designers ensure to minimize this type of cognitive load whenever possible. The third and final type is germane cognitive load. This is the type of cognitive load produced by the overall learning process. Both the intrinsic load and the extraneous load combine together to create this. So that means that if we do an effective job of minimizing the other types of cognitive load, then the germane load will also be reduced. Now let's turn our attention to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. This is where I spend the majority of my time each and every day. When I'm creating lessons or updating associate resources for those who work at the L Brands Care Center, I have to consider how are we presenting this information, because it always contains imagery and words. And since we are combining two types of media, that means it is multimedia, and it is extremely important that we are judicious when adding information, because the potential for cognitive load increases the more that you add to it. To understand this theory, we need to talk about the three basic assumptions. The first assumption is the dual channel assumption. This states that we as humans possess separate channels for processing visual information and auditory information. The interesting thing is, if you visually see a word on the screen, it is processed first visually and then it is processed through the auditory channel. So sometimes there is some jumping between these two channels. The second assumption is the limited capacity assumption. This states that we as humans are only able to process a finite amount of information through each channel at one time. The third assumption is the active processing assumption. This states that we as humans are participating in active learning by attending to relevant information and then processing it in a way that will allow it to make sense to us, and finally linking it to other learned information so that it can be processed in the long-term memory. When faced with multiple types of media, the human brain begins processing, as we discussed in the cognitive load theory, by first accepting the information through the sensory memory and then processing it through the working memory. And this is all done with the goal of transferring the information into your long-term memory by making meaning of the mental models that have been created in your working memory. As you can tell, this process can be extremely taxing if the learner does not take care in processing the information, and we do not take care in the way in which we present the information. Basically, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is an expansion on the cognitive load theory, and this means that we need to keep the important information up front and clearly defined for our learners. We also need to do everything that we can to avoid distractions and make it easy for our learners to be able to find the important information that we are presenting to them. So I hope this quick tutorial on the cognitive theory of multimedia learning and the cognitive load theory has been helpful, and that you will consider what you can do to make your message even more clear the next time you design something for your students. I look forward to talking to you guys a little bit more about these theories and some additional ways in which you can produce effective learning for your students in the coming weeks. For now, I will say goodbye and see you later.